The Beastmen. Strong frontline, fast and furious, the finest beasts and monsters at your disposal. In this video, I will show every unit from the roster and include their stats before and after research, XP, and Redline skills. I will also go over the lords and their specific abilities and skills that they gain in campaign. So before we start, basically I'll have this example here with the Cygor. Hey buddy. So what I have here is of course the unit card and the unit over there, but we also have the stats before and after research, XP, and Redline skills. There's also some special ones not applicable here for the Beastmen, but I'll mention them when applicable, of course. Now, one note there is that the missile strength doesn't have the reload time. I wanted to make sure that you would see the missile strength per volley, you know, that you could see at least a little bit of that. But yeah, I didn't include it. It's there in yellow, as you can see, because it's mainly reload time reduction, but it's not included in the overall amount of weapon strength, missile strength later on. Okay, so yep, this is how I'll present every single unit in the roster here. So, for their army abilities, they do have a Primal Fury in most of their units, which is a passive ability that is enabled if the leadership is higher than 50% of the base. Speed, charge bonus, and melee attack, and immunity to psychology, all of this going into the idea for the Beastmen that they charge in, and they do a lot of damage, and that's how they subdue their enemies. The first charge is very significant to the Beastmen. So the second ability is the Blood Greed, present in many of your monstrous units. More armor, piercing weapon damage, charge bonus, melee attack, and also immunity to psychology, with this effect increases with each kill. So basically, in the later parts of the battle, they'll still do a lot of damage, which is always great. It's always good, and especially that immunity to psychology, it always helps. We start off with Kazrak the One-Eye. Heavily armored, although without a shield, a melee expert, he does have Vanguard deployment, so he plays wonderfully with that idea in mind. He has that good armor, good melee attack and defense values, but it lacks armor, piercing damage, and some hefty health. So he has a great charge bonus, so he can be used in a cycle charge idea. Definitely in combat, that will be the best idea for him. In terms of his abilities in campaign, he does have Vanguard deployment himself and gives it as well to several units, so he'll play out greatly with that idea of having a strong Vanguard army. In addition, he also has Bloodlust, an active ability that you can use to increase the armor-piercing weapon damage of a friendly unit. Other than that, with the quests you will obtain the Scourge ability, a splash attack power, armor-piercing weapon damage and base weapon damage, as well as bonus versus infantry, and the Dark Mail, which only works if he's already in melee, but it will give him quite a nice, decent amount of armor, spell resistance, and most importantly, ward save. Coming up next, we have Malagor the Dark Omen. He's a flying sorcerer with average combat proficiencies, actually. He has great speed to move away from combat and keep himself safe, and good melee attack and still relatively good melee defense, although low armor piercing, low armor, low leadership. Keep him away from combat unless they are really very light targets. He has access to a combined magic lore, including beasts, shadows, death, and wild lores. In campaign, he also has the ability Something Wicked This Way Comes, a leadership debuff that can be upgraded, actually, making armies less willing to fight you. You can gain the cause Fear, even less enemy leadership, and of course even less enemy leadership with the Hex, and even removing immunity to psychology. Really great ability. Then we have the Mantle of Crows. This is basically an unending flock of doom, a Morty's Engine style effect, giving damage to enemy nearby units as long as he is in melee. In addition, he has Unholy Power, basically a buff to his power recharge over there. Finally, in his quests, he will obtain an item, the Icons of Vilification, with an ability to give leadership to nearby units, of course, plus 12 to all allies. Really good. Next we have Morgur Shadowgave. quite an interesting melee lord. He has good health, but very low armor and kind of reduced stats. No armor piercing. He does have the advantage of having poison damage. Low melee attack, decent melee defense, above 40, it's kind of decent still. His main advantage is that he has regeneration and also a missile resistance of 75% and a spell resistance of 25%. This means that enemies will have to get into melee to kill him. For his abilities in campaign, the Spirit Essence of Chaos, a passive ability that summons a unit of Chaos spawn if a unit has less than 20% hit points, causing severe damage to that enemy. Then he has the Aura of Vile Transmutation, in essence giving him a damage-dealing aura to all enemies in its range, 35 meters. He can also obtain Primal Fury, same as others, with the advantage of speed, charge bonus, melee attack, and immunity to psychology. The Bloodlust ability, which you have seen, armor-piercing weapon damage to an ally, and the Staff of Ruinous Corruption, to summon a unit of Chaos spawn, one use only. Taurox the Brass Bull, a melee power by himself, tons of hit points, good armor, good melee attack and melee defense with flaming attacks, and also armor-piercing weapon strength. And then a great deal of charge bonus, so charge him and let him do the damage that you need. For his abilities, he does have Blood Beast, an explosion ability with low radius but good against armor and applies a nice leadership debuff. Then he has Blood Greed, which increases the intensity with each kill, giving him armor piercing, charge bonus, melee attack, immunity to psychology. Slaughterous Call, which gives an augment to allies in the area, charge bonus, more leadership, more melee attack, only enabled if he's already in melee. Then for his skills, he can obtain the Brass Body, which is, if he's in melee, he can obtain a damage, whopping 40% ward save, basically in melee defense, and he can also obtain Gore Feast, which is his regeneration ability. Finally, we do have the Rune Tortured Axis, which gives him quite a nice melee attack and a lot of weapon damage, including armor-piercing weapon damage when he's in melee, so heavily focusing on that melee aspect of him. You can always just get a Beast Lord, a good melee lord, some decent stats, some good armor, not as much as others, but still, you know, good melee attack, lower melee defense, still no focused armor piercing, but he does have, you know, still the Bloodlust ability, more armor piercing weapon damage for an ally, a decent overall lord for you. If you prefer a little bit more power with your lord, the Doom Bull. A great melee combatant, tons of armor, very fast actually, good melee attack, but lower melee defense. But he still has the advantage of having tons of armor-piercing weapon damage. Now for his abilities in campaign, I'll just show it here. He does have Barbed Knuckle Boxing, which is a buff for melee attack and weapon damage. So really good one, a strong melee lord for your front line. If magic is more your thing, then you do have a sorcerer lord in the form of the Great Bray Shaman. You have 4 lords to choose from: the Beasts, Death, Shadows, and Wild. He's relatively a very weak combatant even against other casters, so really keep him out of the front line. Try to make sure that he gets a mount so that you can always keep him away from any foes. Other than the spells, of course, he has 2 abilities. The Distorted Reality, which is an enemy debuff of speed, charge speed, and melee attack in range of him, and also the Darkling Spirit, which gives him the ability to summon a Cygor with 2 uses, which is really cool, although it has a hefty cooldown of 120 seconds. For your heroes, you still have the option, of course, of bringing a caster hero, a Bray Shaman in this case, available in Beasts, Death, Shadow, and Wild lores. He's a spellcaster like many, very weak in combat, low stats all over the board. These are augmented here because he does have access to Primal Fury, but he should always be kept away from combat for the most part. Just ensure that he is mobile. He does have quite a nice amount of speed, but still put him on a mount and ensure that no one gets to him. We have also the Gorbull. He's a powerful hero with excellent armor piercing and a good, hefty bonus versus large. He's great at taking out enemy heroes or lords on mounts. He does lack some melee attack and melee defense values, but has a ton of armor and speed, as well as charge bonus. So take advantage of that and ensure that he survives by just cycle charging him. He does have a lot of hit points for a hero, so he will probably outlast your foe, but still take advantage of that charge bonus for certain. So in campaign he does get Blood Greed and Slaughter's Call. We already spoke about these. Same issue, same thing. But then he can get the Strength of the Land at level 10. This is a choice, so you need to choose which one. So Strength of the Land gives armor and missile resistance to allies in range, or you can get the Unrelenting Warherd, which is a melee attack buff to all allies in range, so you have to choose which one you prefer. Also, if you plan to use him as a hero, he does have a hefty buff for that, so if you use him as a campaign hero, by all means take this, and then you can have him giving Minotaurs terror, or himself also terror, which is always nice. By all means, this is your choice when he gets to level 10. Finally, we have the Wargore, a melee hero, more of a support frontline hero, good armor. He does have a silver shield there to prevent any missile fire, good overall stats, and bonuses versus infantry. For his abilities in campaign, he does have Primal Fury, like many units, giving him speed, charge bonus, and melee attack. He does have Bloodlust, so he can give an ally armor-piercing weapon damage. And in addition, he has the Will of the Dark Gods, which is a melee defense and leadership buff for all allies in an area. Adding to this, you can choose on level 10 between buffs to Bestigors, between buffs to Harpies, Chaos Warhounds, for instance, or Razorgore units. He can also give Tuskgore Chariots or Razorgore Chariots some buffs, as you see there, or just generally some replenished buffs and spread corruption there. For the first unit, we have Unger Spearman Herd. A spear infantry, they are anti-large, but without causing too much damage, really. Don't expect them to hold against anything other than the light cavalry unit, basically. They have very poor armor, leadership, melee attack and melee defense, and in the end, basically, if you buff them all, they will get significantly good melee defense and melee attack, but nothing that will make them be a strong frontline or anything like that. They'll just become a better expendable unit overall. So a better version of the unit is the Unger Spearman Herd with shields. Of course, having that bronze shield, having a little bit more melee defense, this will imply that they are better at holding the flanks and they can still withstand some missile fire, but nothing of a front line for certain. Keep them in the flanks, cover your archers, and that's about it. Even in the late game, what you'll have is just a better version. They can still cover your flanks nicely, giving you a little bit more melee defense, more physical resistance, but still not a front line for sure or for certain. Then we have Unger Herds, basically a non-anti-large variation. They have a little bit more melee attack, and these ones also have that bronze shield, so they can be covered by any missile fire. In addition, all of these Unger units have stalk, so they can move hidden in any terrain, which is also worth to mention. Now, even in the late game, as you can see here, or even as you improve all their stats, they won't be a good front line, maybe a good one for the early game, but other than that, you should move on as soon as possible to better units if you want a steady front line. And now on to a Regiment of Renown, the Destroyers of the Drakwold, the Unger Spearman Herd with shields, ROR. Basically, the very difference of this, of course, having a little bit more stats because they do have 9 experience, but the main difference is that they have poison. So these are a better unit to defend against light cavalry. They'll reduce their speed as well, they'll get a little bit more kills, but nothing that you can put on the front line for sure. So now on to a proper frontline unit, the Gore Herd with shields. They have better hit points, still have that bronze shield, but lacking a little bit of armor and leadership. Basically, they do have better stats overall. Melee attack, melee defense, they get a hefty amount of weapon strength, and as you can see later on, their stats also become quite good, you know, to the point of a tier 2 unit, basically. These units will serve you well into the mid-game, even some compositions in the late late game for certain. Just ensure that you don't get them into too much harm's way, because they do lack that armor and they don't have a lot of armor piercing, so they're more of a holding infantry. Just don't expect them to hold them that much. Now on to a regiment of renown for the Cavalry Shields, the Black Horns Ravagers. Basically better armor, as you can see there, better stats overall. Now this is a good frontline infantry to have. In particular, they do have the advantage of being having the rowdy passive abilities, so they have perfect vigor, which always helps in these cases. Definitely a good unit to have on your front line. Just don't expect them to do too much damage, because they lack a little bit, as the other ones, of armor piercing. The Gore Herd. Now these are basically a more of a damage dealer unit. They have better weapon strength than the previous ones, but of course lacking in the melee defense and having a little bit more melee attack. So definitely have them stay back while the Gore Herd with shields take a little bit of damage, and then just engage with these. As you can see in the late game, they will have quite a hefty amount of melee attack, and even with that leadership, that speed, of course, they can still do that damage, of course lacking a little bit in the armor piercing department. And then we have the Bestigar Herd, basically the top infantry of the Beastmen. Good hit points, very good armor and leadership, and also good melee attack, lacking a little bit in the melee defense. They're more of a damage dealer unit still. The weapon strength is now finally armor piercing, and they do have quite a nice charge bonus. So compared to other frontline infantry, you should always charge them as they are getting engaged to make sure that you get that bonus, and they'll go to town with anyone. In the late game, of course, they benefit from that physical resist, and especially from the melee defense. So that weakness that they have with the melee defense will be overcome by the late game, making them a much stronger choice for your front lines. And now for a regiment of renown, the Korok's Man Rippers from the Bestigar Herd. Still the same as the Bestigar Herd, but now they have bonuses versus large, and they do have that charge defense versus large. So of course, a good option for you to cover your flanks. Of course, you only have one because it's a regiment of renown, but still, it's a great option for you to have a halberd-style unit, basically, against those hefty cavalry units. Medium, even heavy cavalry, they can withstand. Just make sure that they are not attacked by any armor-piercing missiles, of course, because they lack any shield as well. But yeah, a very good addition to your forces. Now to your only missile infantry, the Unger Raiders. Being Ungers, of course, they are expendable, they lack everything in terms of stats, even their missile strength and their range is very poor. You can see even only one of armor-piercing missile damage, but they do have some advantages. They have Vanguard deployment and Stalk, so they're good ambushers. They're really good to be sneaky, to get on the backs of enemies and do their damage. And they actually become much better in the late game for that, because they increase their speed, they increase their ammunition, their missile strength, and reload speed, so they'll do a lot of damage by the time that the enemy realizes they're there. At least they're good ones to have in your flanks, for instance, a couple of units to destroy any flying units, for instance. They're still very good up until the late game. Now, in terms of your cavalry options, let's start with the Centaurs. They are shielded, not a lot of armor, but still they'll block some of the missile fire. And they do have quite good speed, lower melee attack and melee defense than what we would hope for, and the charge bonus. So all in all, a very good shock cavalry. And a shock cavalry, they really become in the late game. You know, more charge bonus, more speed, definitely more speed, and still good good melee attack, good melee defense, good weapon strength. So overall, cycle charge these guys, especially in the late game, to get the most out of them. Their biggest advantage is, of course, that they do have that shield and speed in their favor. Now for a chariot unit, the Cavalry Chariots, armored very well with 80 armor, good speed, Not a lot of melee attack and melee defense, as most chariots do, and they are still armor piercing and with the hefty bonuses versus infantry, so of course use them against that armored infantry for sure. They have a lot of charge bonus, so ensure that you charge them in and that you keep cycle charging them as much as possible. Now in the late game, they actually get some good bonuses. More speed, more charge bonus of course is always great, they'll do their job much better, but the advantage is that they'll also get a lot of melee defense, which is typically the weakness of chariots. So definitely they'll become good units even within the late game, and note that they also get a little bit of missile resistance, so furthering that late game idea that you can still use these guys. And now another unit of Centaurs, in this case with great weapons. So the main advantage is they do have that armor piercing damage, so they're much better at taking down armored targets. They still have all the benefits of a shock cavalry. Good charge bonus, good speed. They get a lot of it in the late game, so they'll still be a good armor piercing unit for you to use at that point in time, although rather fragile with low armor and this time without a shield. So keep that in mind if you intend to use them. Now for a regiment of renown, the Sons of Goros. Basically, as the great weapons Centaurs, they still have the perfect vigor, I didn't mention it before, and they also have Guardian, so granting physical resistance plus 15% to any lord or hero. So they're a great unit to accompany a lord or hero to ensure that he gets that buff, and as also they have magical attacks, so a very good unit to use against any ethereal units or against any units with high physical amounts of resistance such as demons. Yeah, overall a good regiment of renown unit. Now to a chariot unit again, the Razorgore Chariots. Quite a decent chariot indeed. They have good armor, very good speed, melee attack is quite high, melee defense still a little bit low, but not as much as other chariot units. They still have good weapon strength, including armor piercing and bonuses versus infantry, and a hefty charge bonus, so keep them charging, they'll do a lot of damage, especially in the late game, where they get even more speed, more weapon strength, more charge bonus, and to overcome their weaknesses, better melee defense and better melee attack. So definitely they almost become like a melee chariot, if it can be, but that you won't need to keep charging so much. Of course you will benefit from that, but still they have better survivability than other chariot units, so well into the late game you can use these guys. Now to your missile cavalry, the Centaurs with throwing axes. The advantage of these boys is that they do have armor piercing missile damage, which is always nice, and especially because they have that speed, they'll be able to get into the flanks, throw their missiles, and do a lot of damage to any armor piercing target, especially anyone slower than them. They do have the advantage of having perfect vigor, so they'll never get tired as long as that leadership is higher than wavering, which is always excellent, especially for this type of unit. Indeed, a good unit to keep on the enemy in front of them or in the flanks, trying to make sure that they try to catch them and they'll fail, and they'll take a lot of damage. In the late game, they'll just do this job much better. Better missile strength, better reload time, so they'll pepper their missiles much faster, a good amount of melee attack and melee defense and speed should they be caught by enemies, by all means. Still, the bigger weakness of these guys is their lack of armor and low hit point count, so make sure that they don't strike anything with good amount of missiles, because they'll die very fast. And now to a regiment of renown unit, the Grog Hooves of Wolf's Run. The Centaurs throwing axes ROR. Basically, the advantage of these guys, far from the better stats, of course, typically, they do have poison in both their melee attack and their armor piercing missile strength, which is even bigger than the other units. Now, they also have a great advantage in this Drunken Bravado. They have a healing, they regenerate, which is really cool. As long as the leadership is high, they'll regenerate. So a great unit to have in your flanks trying to catch those slower units. They'll become even faster as well as other Centaurs, so yeah, a great addition to your army. We start with some Chaos Warhounds. Basically, a very fast unit, that's their advantage. They do have some missile resistance, and they not have a lot of stats, melee attack, low armor, low melee attack, low leadership even, low weapon strength, not a lot of armor piercing damage. Their main idea is to get on the backs of the enemy, get in on their artillery units, get on their missile units, and thwart them so that they cannot fire on your better units. In the late game, they do get a little bit more physical resist and missile resistance, and as well charge bonus in speed, so you can still use a couple of these in some armies, at least into the mid game, or if you don't get to have any better choices, always count on them of doing a good job of getting rid of enemy artillery. For a better option, you do have Chaos Warhounds with poison. The advantage, of course, is that their melee attacks cause poison. Now, still not a lot in terms of stats, of course, and also in the late game, the same idea applies. Better to use them to chase any routing enemies or just cause them to rout. They're really fast, they do have Vanguard deployment, so by all means, this is not exactly the best late game unit, but you can still find uses for one or two, at least into the mid game. Coming up next, we have Harpies, a good flying unit. They do have low stats overall, but their good speed, their good weapon strength and melee defense can cause some trouble. They'll be more resilient than it looks like. These are not Felbats, you know. And particularly in the late game, they do get a little bit more missile resistance and physical resistance, and decent speed and charge bonus increase. So they can still do that cycle charging idea, especially against enemy flyers or enemy low quality infantry, maybe going after archers or artillery. That's their main use. So even early to mid game, definitely a couple of these units will be great in your armies. Now to an interesting unit with the Razorgut Herd. Basically, these are armor-piercing dogs, honestly. They have better stats overall, you know, a little bit more armor, good speed still, good charge bonus, but armor-piercing weapon strength. They do have the weakness of having the Rampage, so they can ignore your orders and just go on their own. But in the late game, they get quite significant stat boosts, so including, you know, better melee attack, better melee defense. Still a nice hefty amount of weapon strength, charge bonus, and speed, as you should. So yeah, definitely they are still useful well into the late game as a charge cavalry on their own. So yeah, very good unit. I really love to have a couple of them, especially early to mid game, as applicable, so that they replace kind of the dogs into getting after the backline of the enemy. The Feral Manticore, a single entity which is basically a cycle charge monster, really. Not a lot of armor, not a good amount of melee attack, and not a lot of melee defense, and weapon strength, it's not too much armor piercing, but it has a little bit of amount, so it's kind of cool on that, and a good charge bonus. So adding with the speed and the charge bonus, that's what makes it a good unit, and you can see that it increases even further in the late game, which is really cool. So more of a cycle charge monster. It's good to take on those single entities, those flyers, maybe not on its own with some support, but it's quite a phenomenal unit in itself. Now, it does have the biggest weakness, Rampage, so it can go into Rampage and avoid your orders, so be careful with that. Hopefully, of course, with the added leadership from the experience, it won't do as much, but still be careful with using him in prolonged combat, as he doesn't have a lot of stats, even well within the late game. The Chaos Spawn, a monster's infantry, one of the first beasts that you have access to. In essence, what they have is a good amount of weapon strength, which is not a lot of armor piercing, but still a decent amount, let's say. They can deal with low, mid-tier infantry really well, low, mid-tier cavalry really well. They have poison attacks as well, so they can reduce those enemy stats, and the best advantage is that they are unbreakable. Nothing will stand before them until they die. That's basically the idea. In the late game, as you can see here, they'll just become much better in terms of weapon strength and melee attacks, so they'll do a lot more damage and thus survive a little bit longer. They also have a hefty missile resistance, which should count, and also an additional little bit of speed. So not the best unit for your front line for sure, but best used to use to engage that front line with some support and try to break through into the back line of the enemy. Now to one of my favorite units in the entire game, the Minotaurs. This is a favorite of mine ever since Heroes of Might and Magic 3, so you can imagine how long I've been loving these Minotaurs. So, an armor-piercing infantry killer unit, basically. They do have that bonuses versus infantry, tons of armor-piercing damage, a good hefty charge bonus, but they do like a little bit of melee defense and armor. Now, they will wreck anything that they find in their path, but they'll also die swiftly. However, they have the Blood Greed ability, remember, so more armor-piercing weapon damage, charge bonus, and melee attack, increasing with each kill. So the more they kill, the better they are at killing. Now, in the late game, they do kind of overcome their issues. So they gain up to 47 melee defense, which is always nice. They gain a little bit more armor, more leadership, more speed. But in essence, they just become better. More weapon strength, definitely a lot more weapon strength, more melee attack, so they'll hit harder and they'll manage to fight off against even greater foes. Just ensure that you don't put them in combat against any anti-large unit, as they may suffer. And now the Minotaurs with shields. It would appear that the only thing they gain is actually a little bit more armor and the shield, the silver shield. It's already a good change, but note that they lose actually their anti-infantry bonus. So these are more of a frontline Minotaur unit designed to withstand a little bit more damage, while they still do a lot of damage, but still, remember, you know, more of a jack of all trades, if I say, and overall better at staying on the front line. If you want a front line full of Minotaurs, by all means. They still have that Blood Greed ability, of course, so they'll do some damage, definitely, and especially in the late game, of course, they gain a little bit more armor, becoming over 50, so that is always good, and definitely a lot of melee defense, as you can see there, up to 62. So if you want a Minotaur unit that will actually survive for the long time, bring this. If you want the anti-infantry killer, bring the other unshielded variant. Now to a regiment of renown, the Butchers of Kalkengard. Still based on the Minotaurs with shields, so they still lack that anti-infantry bonus, still the same weapon strength. But overall better stats, of course, more leadership, more melee attack, more melee defense, definitely a lot of melee defense. Their biggest difference is that they have regeneration. So these guys are definitely killers. Just put them, whatever army you put them, they'll go to town to anyone, really. And they still have the Blood Greed, so what else can you want from a Minotaur unit? One of my favorites, definitely good in any army. Now, as if it wasn't enough, you still have Minotaurs with great weapons. The difference of these guys being that they are anti-large, so they're best used against other monsters, single entities, cavalry, whatever. They'll destroy them, they'll wreck them for sure. Now, after you upgrade them, of course, they still don't have a lot of melee defense, so be careful, they still can take damage, but they will do so much damage to anything large. Just ensure that they're always hitting those best targets, and they will do great for you. A wonderful addition to any Beastmen army for certain. Just ensure that you always hit the best targets, namely large targets, heroes, single entities, whatever. The Giant. A lot of hit points, not a lot of armor, not a lot of speed, but a huge amount of melee attack, not a lot of melee defense, so now you know their weakness. They do have a tremendous amount of weapon strength, most of it armor piercings. Wherever they hit, they're gonna hit really well and hard. Now, they do have also the Wall Breaker. It allows them to attack and destroy walls in melee, which may be useful. And in addition, they do cause terror. They're best used against... they do state that it is an anti-infantry, but I like to use them against any single entities, just because of that amount of weapon strength and melee attack. They'll hit them, of course they'll take damage, but they'll also hit those single entities like lords or heroes, especially with some support. So they're good at it as well. Now, in the late game, they get even more weapon strength, to up to 900 of it, and they still have 40% missile resistance, so their weakness is slightly overcome by that, although they will still have low melee defense, which is a pain, but still, you can use this as an anti-infantry or an anti-lord, hero, whatever you choose. Just make sure that they are not attacked by any anti-large units. The Jabberslith, an anti-infantry armor-piercing monster, basically. He does have magical attacks and poison attacks, so he'll reduce the stats of any enemies that he's fighting against. In addition, not a lot of armor and not a lot of leadership, really, but a good amount of melee attack and melee defense, and definitely armor-piercing weapon damage, which is what we want. But his special abilities are what make him so great. He does have the Spurting Bile Blood. It's a vortex ability that recharges when he's engaged in melee. In addition, he has a sort of Mortis Engine effect. He causes damage per second to enemies in range, but only if he's in melee and only if the enemies are lower than the 50% of their leadership. So you should use the Jabberslith against units that have already been depleted somewhat so that he can go to town and finish them up. Now, in the late game, he can do this much better. He does get a lot of bonuses to his melee attack and melee defense and weapon strength, and you have to remember the poison damage, so he can survive a lot in the middle, in the thick of things, and just cause damage with that Mortis engine. By all means, the biggest issue is that he is weak against missile fire, but he will get more missile resistance up to 30%, so that can help out, especially in the late game. A menace of a unit. And now to a regiment of renown, the Vorbergland Broodmother. I definitely did not say that name badly. So here's the Jabberslith ROR. In essence, he trades the poison for sundered armor, diminishing the armor of the enemy. So basically really good at causing damage to those heavily armored targets. Really great. Now, in addition, his vortex changes. Instead of giving poison, it gives sundered armor as well. And in addition, the vortex damage becomes armor piercing. So he's really good at taking down armor targets, and he still has that aura of madness. So overall, better stats of the unit, and you should use this guy definitely against any armored infantry. Just be sure that, as always, keep him safe of any missile damage, any anti-large targets or armor-piercing targets, because he may fall to those. If you want an anti-large monster, we have the best one for you, the Gorgon. Tons of weapon strength with the bonuses, of course, versus large, and he does have a lot of melee attack, almost as much as the giant there. Not a lot of melee defense, not a lot of armor, no shield, so he's still vulnerable to those, but still, this is a unit that he will use against any hero or lord on mounts. He'll do a lot of damage to them. It's great to have him fight against any single entities. In addition, he has Blood Greed, so the more kills, the better. This is a good idea for him. It's a good idea for him to get some kills early on, so maybe get him against a lower quality infantry so that he can increase that blood greed, and then you finally get him to fight someone that you really need, like a lord or hero or another single entity. And he has one of the best abilities, of course, which is regeneration. He regenerates when he's in melee. Keep him fighting, he'll regenerate, he'll survive. It's really a great addition to any Beastmen army. In the late game, he gets a lot of good buffs, more missile resistance, which is one of his weaknesses, more weapon damage, so he'll get over that, even more melee attack and some speed. So yeah, definitely a great addition to any army, especially in the late game. By all means, get some Gorgons there. Now to a regiment of renown, the Blood Brute Behemoth, the regiment of renown Gorgon. So as if you didn't need anything else against single entities, here we have it. One of the best units to fight against any other single entity. Just send him, go to town, and he'll kill them. Now, one of the things that he has is the Mark of Khorne. So he gains Frenzy, which means that he'll do even more damage and have the immunity to psychology still if his leadership is higher than 50%. So pretty cool. As always, because he has the blood greed, you should get some kills early on, maybe some weak infantry that you can, farm for it, and then when this is, intense enough, then you can go for your target, which should be, any armor any armored large target, because he does have armor piercing and bonuses versus large. So yeah, he'll go to town against those. Better stats overall than the other Gorgon, and still he does have the strength from flesh, the regeneration. So yeah, a great addition. You can kill anything with this guy as long as you get him some support and you keep him away, of course, from missiles or any anti-large infantry, for instance. But yeah, great addition to any Beastmen army composition. The Cygor is your specialist artillery. Basically, a great amount of range. It's really cool that it has 400 range. The missile strength is armor piercing, which is always nice. And he can still withstand, some melee because he is an armor piercing beast. Not a lot of melee defense and not a lot of armor means he will still die. So be careful with that. In addition, he does have a hefty spell resistance, 25%, and he has an aura. Basically, passive ability in an area which is all the area, it's infinite, and it affects the miscast chance plus 50%. So Cygors are also really good to deny enemy casters some ability, which is always excellent. Now, as always with artillery units, just be sure that you keep them supported. In the late game, however, his spell resistance increases to 50%, which is always nice. His reload time reduces heavily, and his weapon strength, missile strength is even improved. And then the best thing is that actually his stats improve quite well. He gets a lot of melee attack and melee defense, to the point that he can defend himself a little bit more. And even if you spend all of your ammunition, he can still be a good single entity to fight. A wonderful addition to any Beastmen army. And finally, last but not least, the Eye of Morrslieb, a regiment of renowned Cygor. Now, he's still an artillery piece, same range, but a lot more missile strength, which is magical damage. He also has melee magical attacks, so he's good against those ethereal units, those physical resistant units, such as demons, for instance. It's really cool. He has better stats overall than the original Cygor, of course, and one advantage that he still has that Soul Eater, so good against casters, really, but he has even a better ability, the Warp Gaze, a hex ability denying movement to any enemies with a decent range. 100 meters is decent range, and 12 seconds, so he's really cool at trapping those units so that your units can charge on them and do a lot of damage. Definitely a wonderful addition to any army. Just make sure that you have the ability, that you remember the Warp Gaze, that you remember this ability, so that you can maximize on it. And there you go, all of the Beastmen units before, after, research, redline skills, and XP. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll be making one for every single race, and I hope this helps you out, preparing your army compositions for the game, or just enjoying it a little bit more and checking out your favorite units in a different light. So thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.